On the edge of Butte sits a wound that will never heal. The Berkeley pit stretches more than a mile across, dropping nearly 2,000 feet into the earth. Its water glows with an unnatural redness, stained by dissolved metals and acids strong enough to burn skin. No fish swim in these depths. No birds land on its surface without dying. This massive crater, visible from space, stands as a monument to what was taken and what was left behind. A century ago, this hill held one of the richest copper deposits ever discovered. Beneath the streets of Butte, more than 10,000 miles of tunnels spread through the rock like veins through a body. In the darkness below, men carved out an underground empire. The city that rose above those tunnels earned a name that echoed across the world, the richest hill on earth. At its peak, nearly 100,000 people called this place home. The wealth pulled from the ground seemed endless, flowing out in rivers of copper that powered America's rise into the electric age. But Butte's fortune was never its own. The copper belonged to corporations whose headquarters sat a continent away. When the profit margins shifted, when new methods required fewer workers, when the mathematics of extraction no longer made sense, those distant owners made a choice. They drained the wealth, abandoned the responsibility, and walked away. What remains is a city built entirely for extraction, left to face the consequences alone. This is the story of how the richest hill on earth became the deepest scar in the American landscape. If you enjoy uncovering the history of these American cities and their secrets, you're welcome to subscribe and explore more with me. Chapter 1. The Beginning, a Hill of Promise. Before Butte became anything, it was nothing. A barren hill rose from the high plains of Montana Territory, treeless and exposed to winds that cut across the landscape without mercy. Sagebrush clung to thin soil. In winter, snow piled in drifts and stayed for months. In summer, the sun baked the ground hard as stone. Native peoples passed through but never settled. There was nothing here worth staying for, nothing that suggested this desolate rise would one day attract the attention of the world. That changed in the 1860s when the first prospectors arrived, following rumors of gold. These men had chased fortune through California, Nevada, and Idaho. They carried picks, pans, and an unshakable belief that the next big strike waited just over the horizon. When they reached the barren hill, they began digging with the same fever that had driven them across half a continent. The gold they found disappointed them. Small deposits appeared in the gulches, enough to justify a rough camp, but nothing compared to the legendary strikes elsewhere. Men worked the gravel with pans and sluice boxes, pulling out modest amounts of color. A few stayed, most moved on, convinced the hill held nothing of real value. Then came silver. In the late 1860s, prospectors pushing deeper into the rock discovered silver deposits rich enough to change their fortunes. A small rush followed. The camp grew from a handful of tents to a collection of rough cabins and a few modest mining operations. For a brief moment, it seemed silver might justify the harsh conditions and isolation. The camp earned a name, Butte, though no one remembers exactly why. But silver was only the beginning. As miners dug deeper, following the silver veins down into the earth, they kept hitting something else. A reddish-brown rock appeared in greater and greater quantities. At first, they saw it as an obstacle, worthless material blocking their path to the silver. They tossed it aside in growing piles. Some miners recognized it as copper ore, but copper held little value. The metal was heavy, difficult to transport, and brought poor prices compared to gold or silver. What those early prospectors could not have known was that beneath their feet lay one of the richest copper deposits nature had ever created. Hundreds of millions of years earlier, volcanic activity and mineral-rich water had concentrated copper into this single hill through a geological accident of extraordinary scale. The deposit was not just large, it was vast beyond comprehension, spreading through the rock in veins so thick and numerous that the hill itself seemed more copper than stone. And timing, as it turned out, mattered more than anyone could have predicted. In the 1870s and 1880s, America began to change. Thomas Edison perfected the light bulb. Cities started installing electric streetlights. Telegraph lines spread across the country. Copper, which conducted electricity better than any other affordable metal, suddenly became essential. Demand exploded. Prices climbed. The worthless brown rock littering Butte's mining camps transformed overnight into treasure. Prospectors who had dismissed the copper deposits now looked at them with new eyes. Small operations began extracting the ore, shipping it by wagon to distant smelters. Word spread through mining camps and financial centers. Investors took notice. Engineers studied the geology and realized what they were seeing. This was not just another mining prospect. This was something different, something that could supply the world's appetite for copper for decades. But the sheer scale of the deposit presented a problem. Individual prospectors working with hand tools could barely scratch the surface. The copper ran deep, spreading through countless veins that required systematic extraction. Mining this hill would not be a matter of a few men with picks. It would require capital, machinery, and industrial organization on a scale the West had never seen. The hill held enough copper to power a nation, but only if someone could figure out how to pull it from the ground. Chapter 2: The Rise, Building the Underground Empire. Between 1870 and 1900, Butte transformed from a collection of rough cabins into one of the most important cities in the American West. The change happened with a speed that seemed impossible. In 1870, perhaps a few hundred people scratched out a living on the barren hill. By 1890, the population had surged past 30,000. By the turn of the century, it would climb higher still. People arrived on every train, in every wagon, walking if they had to. Word had spread. There was work in Butte, and the work would not run out anytime soon. The copper that had seemed worthless now commanded premium prices. Mining operations multiplied across the hill. What began as individual prospectors digging shallow holes evolved into something unprecedented. Companies sank shafts straight down into the earth, dropping hundreds of feet through solid rock. From those shafts, tunnels began spreading outward in every direction, following the copper veins wherever they led. The tunnels multiplied like roots growing beneath a tree. Each mining company carved its own network, pushing deeper and wider in pursuit of ore. Side tunnels branched from main passages. Crosscuts connected different levels. Ventilation shafts pierced upward toward the surface. The work never stopped. 3 shifts of miners rotated through every 24 hours, descending into the darkness, blasting and drilling and hauling rock. As the years passed, the underground maze grew more complex, more extensive, more impossible to fully map. Eventually, the tunnel, network beneath Butte, would stretch beyond 10,000 miles. To comprehend that distance requires imagination. It was enough tunnel to cross the entire United States 3 times over. The passages ran deeper than the hill was tall, dropping more than a mile beneath the surface. Some tunnels flooded with scalding water, heated by the earth itself. Others filled with poisonous gases that could kill a man in seconds. The network connected mines that had different owners, creating a subterranean world where property lines blurred and legal battles erupted over who had the right to ore discovered in disputed passages. Above ground, the city rose to match the tunnels below. Frame buildings appeared along muddy streets. Then came brick structures, stone facades, and eventually the grand buildings that announced Butte's arrival as a place of real consequence. The population continued climbing as word spread across oceans. This was a place where a man could find work, where the mines always needed more hands, where someone willing to descend into the darkness could earn wages that seemed impossible in the old country. The Irish came first and in the greatest numbers. They had experience in the mines of Cornwall and Ireland, and they knew copper work. They established neighborhoods in the gulches and claimed positions of influence in the mines. The Finns followed, bringing their own mining traditions and a reputation for hard, silent work. Italians settled in Meaderville on the east side, building churches and social halls and filling the air with familiar dialects. Chinese immigrants established a community despite facing discrimination and violence. Eastern Europeans arrived from a dozen different regions, each group maintaining its own language, customs, and sense of identity. The city organized itself along ethnic lines. Dublin Gulch became the heart of Irish Butte, with its own churches, saloons, and social organizations. Finntown developed its own character, with sauna bathhouses and cooperative societies. Each neighborhood functioned almost as a separate village, yet all were tied together by the mines. Men from different ethnic backgrounds might live in separate parts of town, attend different churches, and speak different languages, but underground they worked side by side in the same crews, facing the same dangers. Butte never slept. The mines operated around the clock, and the city above matched that rhythm. Saloons stayed open 24 hours to serve miners coming off shift at any time of day or night. At 3 in the morning, the streets bustled with as much activity as noon. Men fresh from underground walked into bars still covered in rock dust, ordering whiskey and beer to wash away the taste of the mines. Theaters offered entertainment at odd hours. The red light district, one of the most notorious in the West, operated without rest, providing services to men who worked in the darkness and wanted release when they surfaced. The wealth flowing from beneath the hill grew staggering. Copper prices climbed year after year. The mines produced thousands of tons of ore daily. Smelters worked constantly, filling the sky with dark smoke that could be seen for miles. The money generated from this production found its way into bank accounts in distant cities. Mine owners and major investors accumulated fortunes that placed them among the wealthiest men in America. Yet the men who did the actual work, who descended into the tunnels every day and blasted the rock and hauled the ore, lived in modest circumstances at best. They rented small houses or rooms in boarding houses. Their families survived on wages that provided basic necessities but little comfort. The contrast was stark and growing more obvious with each passing year. Grand buildings rose in the better parts of town, financed by mining profits, while whole neighborhoods remained rough and unpaved. The wealth existed, but it did not spread evenly. The nickname emerged naturally from this reality: the richest hill on earth. Newspaper writers used the phrase, and it stuck because it was true. No other place on the planet produced copper in such quantities. The hill was literally a mountain of wealth, and everyone knew it. The phrase carried pride, but also an edge of irony. Rich for whom? The investors in New York and Boston certainly grew wealthy. The mine managers and engineers did well. But the men in the tunnels, the ones who made the extraction possible, remained working class. Out of this tension grew another identity. Butte became known as the Gibraltar of unionism. The miners organized early and aggressively. The Butte Miners Union formed in 1878 and quickly became one of the most powerful labor organizations in America. Miners understood that their labor created all the wealth, and they demanded better wages, safer conditions, and respect. The union grew strong because solidarity underground translated to solidarity above. Men who trusted each other with their lives in the tunnels were willing to stand together in strikes and negotiations. The city that emerged from this chaotic growth was unlike anywhere else. It combined industrial might with frontier wildness. Opera houses stood blocks away from rough gambling halls. Mansions overlooked neighborhoods of workers' cottages. Ethnic diversity created a cultural complexity rare in Western mining towns. The mines provided the foundation, but the character came from the people who arrived from around the world and built their lives around the dangerous work of pulling copper from beneath their feet. By 1900, Butte had become the largest city between Chicago and the Pacific Coast, a metropolis built on copper, carved from the hill itself, alive with possibility and shadowed by the knowledge that everything depended on what could be extracted from below. Chapter 3: The Copper Kings. War for the Hill. As Butte's copper wealth grew obvious to the world, 3 men emerged to fight for control of the hill. They would become known as the Copper Kings, and their battle for dominance would shape not just Butte, but the entire state of Montana. What they unleashed was not simply business competition. It was war, fought with money, lawyers, newspapers, bribed officials, and occasionally violence. The prize was control of the richest copper deposit on Earth, and none of them intended to lose. Marcus Daly arrived first. Born in Ireland in 1841, he came to America as a teenager with nothing. He worked his way up from common miner to mine manager through skill, determination, and an instinct for finding ore that bordered on supernatural. Other managers would study geology reports and assay results. Daly would walk into a tunnel, touch the rock, and seem to know what lay deeper. In 1876, he purchased a silver mine called the Anaconda. While others saw a modest silver prospect, Daly recognized something different. He pushed the tunnels deeper, and at 300 feet, the silver played out. But beneath it, he found copper in quantities that took his breath away. Daly had vision. He understood that this deposit required more than a mine. It needed a complete industrial system: mines, smelters, railroads, timber operations, and a company town where workers could live. He built all of it, establishing the town of Anaconda 26 miles from Butte to house his smelting operations. He attracted investors from San Francisco, men with deep pockets who shared his ambition. The Anaconda Mining Company became the dominant force in Butte, producing copper on a scale that amazed even experienced mining men. Daley was generous to his workers by the standards of the era, building hospitals and libraries, keeping wages relatively high. But he was also building an empire, and empires require control. William Andrews Clark presented a stark contrast. Born in Pennsylvania in 1839, he arrived in Montana during the gold rush and made his first fortune through banking and merchandising, selling supplies to miners at inflated prices. He was brilliant with money, ruthless in business, and completely lacking in charm. Where Daley inspired loyalty, Clark inspired fear and resentment. He accumulated mining properties across Butte through shrewd purchases and aggressive tactics. He built smelters to compete with Daley. He bought banks, water companies, newspapers, and anything else that provided leverage. Clark's defining characteristic was his naked pursuit of power. He wanted to be a United States Senator, viewing the position as the ultimate validation of his success. In the 1890s, state legislatures still chose senators, which meant the seat could be bought if you had enough money and few scruples. Clark had plenty of money and no scruples at all. He spent fortunes bribing Montana legislators, distributing cash in envelopes, making promises, and building a political machine designed for one purpose: to send William Clark to Washington. The hatred between Daley and Clark became legendary. It was personal, deep, and seemingly without rational cause. Perhaps it began with business competition. Perhaps Daley resented Clark's crude tactics. Perhaps Clark envied Daley's popularity. Whatever the origin, their feud consumed both men and dragged the entire state into their battle. When Clark ran for Senate, Daley worked to defeat him, spending his own fortune to buy opposing votes. When Daley wanted the state capital moved to Anaconda, where he could control it, Clark spent heavily to keep it in Helena. They each owned newspapers that published vicious attacks on the other. The Anaconda Standard, Daley's paper, portrayed Clark as a corrupt oligarch destroying democracy. Clark's papers painted Daley as a dangerous immigrant trying to rule Montana like an Irish clan chief. Their battle turned Montana politics into theater of the absurd. Legislators received bribes from both sides, sometimes accepting money from each and then voting for whoever paid more. Committee meetings descended into shouting matches. The national press covered Montana's political circus with bemused horror. Reformers and honest politicians, the few who existed, found themselves marginalized. The state government functioned as a subsidiary of copper interests, with laws written to benefit mines and courts ruling according to which king had more influence. Into this poisonous atmosphere stepped the third king. F. Augustus Heinze arrived in Butte in 1889, a young man of 20 who had studied mining engineering at Columbia. He was handsome, charming, and absolutely fearless. Where Daley and Clark had built their fortunes over decades, Heinze intended to make his in a few years through audacity and legal manipulation. He studied Montana's mining laws and realized they contained a flaw that could be exploited. The law gave ownership of a vein to whoever discovered it, even if that vein ran beneath someone else's property. With the right lawyers and friendly judges, a clever man could claim her from his competitors' mines. Heinze played the game brilliantly. He purchased small mining properties strategically located near the richest claims. Then he sank shafts and pushed tunnels toward the boundaries, looking for any vein that crossed property lines. When his miners broke into a rich vein, even if that vein clearly belonged to a neighboring mine, Heinze would file a lawsuit, claiming discovery rights. The cases would go before judges he had carefully cultivated, sometimes bribed. The judges would rule in his favor. While the legal battle dragged on, Heinze's crews would mine the disputed ore as fast as possible, extracting millions of dollars worth of copper that rightfully belonged to his rivals. The Anaconda Company became his primary target. Heinze filed hundreds of lawsuits against them, tying up their operations in endless litigation. He appealed every ruling that went against him. He moved cases between courts, seeking friendly venues. When Anaconda tried to mine certain areas, Heinze would get injunctions stopping all work. His lawyers created such chaos in the Montana court system that legitimate cases could take years to resolve. All the while, Heinz's miners worked in disputed tunnels, following veins wherever they led, pulling out ore that probably belonged to someone else. Heinz understood public relations in ways the older kings did not. He positioned himself as the champion of the working man, fighting against the giant Anaconda Company on behalf of small independent operators. He paid good wages and gave speeches praising labor unions. His newspaper, the Réveil, published attacks on Anaconda's corporate power while ignoring Heinz's own manipulations. Many Butte miners supported him, seeing him as preferable to distant corporate ownership. The reality was more complex. Heinz was robbing the other companies blind through legal trickery, but he did it with style and shared enough of the wealth to maintain support. The three-way battle reached levels of absurdity that seemed impossible even by Gilded Age standards. All three kings owned newspapers that published daily attacks on the others. Clark's papers accused Daly of being a pawn of San Francisco financiers. Daly's papers portrayed Clark as the most corrupt man in Montana. Heinz's papers painted both as greedy monopolists. Editors published rumors, lies, and character assassinations as if they were news. Readers learned to distrust everything they read, knowing that journalism had become simply another weapon in the copper wars. Violence simmered beneath the legal and political battles. Rival mining crews occasionally fought underground when they broke into each other's tunnels. Men loyal to different kings brawled in saloons. Mysterious fires broke out in mines and buildings. While direct evidence of murder is scarce, more than a few men died in circumstances that suggested assassination rather than accident. The kings were willing to use any tool available, and intimidation through violence remained a reliable tool. The human cost of these battles remained largely invisible to the kings themselves. Miners worked in tunnels that were contested in dozens of lawsuits, never certain if their employer would exist next month. When an injunction shut down a mine, workers lost their jobs immediately. The kings made and broke political careers, purchased judges, and corrupted every institution they touched, all in pursuit of personal wealth and power. The state government became a puppet show, where copper interests pulled the strings. Democracy existed in name only. The war finally ended through exhaustion and consolidation. In 1899, a group of East Coast financiers, backed by Rockefeller money, formed the Amalgamated Copper Company and began buying out the kings. They purchased Daly's Anaconda Company, bringing the largest mining operation under their control. Clark, old and tired of fighting, gradually withdrew from active mining to focus on his political ambitions. He finally achieved his Senate seat in 1901, though the victory was so tainted by bribery that he served only one term. Heinz held out longer, continuing his legal warfare against the new corporate giant. Amalgamated responded by shutting down all mining operations across Montana in 1903, throwing thousands out of work and demanding the state change its laws to stop Heinz's court manipulation. The pressure worked. The legislature rewrote the mining laws and reformed the court system. Heinz realized he had lost. In 1906, he sold his properties to Amalgamated for $10 million and left Montana. He would die in New York a few years later, his fortune gone, destroyed by Wall Street speculation. By 1910, the era of the Copper Kings had ended. One entity now controlled Butte, the Amalgamated Copper Company, which would soon rename itself the Anaconda Company. The consolidation brought stability, but it also brought a fundamental change. When Daly, Clark, and Heinz controlled the mines, they lived in Montana. Their mansions stood in Butte. Their families knew the miners. They had personal stakes in the city's future, even if their methods were ruthless. The new corporate owners lived in New York and Boston. Butte became simply another asset in a portfolio, a source of copper and profit. Decisions about the city's future would now be made in distant boardrooms by men who had never descended into the tunnels, never walked the streets, never felt any connection to the place beyond the numbers on quarterly reports. The hills still produced copper, the mines still operated, but control had shifted in a way that would determine everything that followed. Butte belonged to people who did not live there, who did not care about it beyond what could be extracted. The Copper Kings had fought for power with a passion born of personal ambition. The corporation that replaced them had no passion at all, only calculation. And that difference would eventually matter more than anyone realized. Chapter 4. Life Underground, the Miner's World. Every morning, hundreds of men walked to the shaft houses scattered across Butte's Hill. They carried lunch pails, wore rough work clothes, and descended into an underworld that most people above could not imagine. The entrance to the mines was a cage, an elevator with open sides that dropped straight down through the shaft. Men crowded into these cages, 20 or 30 at a time, standing shoulder to shoulder as the operator released the brake. The descent began with a lurch. The cage fell into darkness, dropping at speeds that made stomachs float. Cold air rushed past as the surface light faded to a pinpoint and disappeared. The walls of the shaft flew by, occasionally lit by small lights at different levels. The cage dropped 500 feet, 1,000, sometimes 1,500 feet or more, descending for what felt like forever, but lasted only minutes. When it finally slowed and stopped with a jarring clang at the assigned level, men stepped out into a different world. The heat struck first. Deep underground, the temperature could reach over 100 degrees. In some parts of the mines, it climbed even higher. The air hung thick and heavy, hard to breathe, even before the dust filled it. Men stripped to the waist within minutes, their bodies slick with sweat that never dried. The humidity came from water seeping through cracks in the rock, from underground streams, from the earth itself, pressing moisture into the confined spaces. The tunnels stretched in every direction, carved from solid rock, supported by timber frames. Some passages were tall enough to stand upright. Others required men to stoop or crawl. Electric lights strung along the main tunnels provided dim illumination, but many side passages remained dark except for the carbide lamps each miner carried on his cap. The smell was distinctive: rock dust, powder smoke from blasting, the sharp scent of carbide, human sweat, and the damp mineral odor of the earth itself. The work followed a brutal routine. Miners drilled holes into the rock face using pneumatic drills that shook their entire bodies. The noise was tremendous, a rattling roar that made conversation impossible. Rock dust exploded from the drill holes, filling the air with particles fine enough to penetrate deep into lungs. Men worked through clouds so thick they could barely see their partners. At the end of each drilling shift, powder men loaded the holes with dynamite, set fuses, and cleared everyone back. The explosions came in sequence, throwing rock fragments and filling the tunnels with acrid smoke. After the blasts, muckers shoveled the broken ore into cars that ran on narrow-gauge tracks. Timbering required constant attention. The weight of thousands of feet of rock pressed down on every tunnel. Without support, passages would collapse. Timbermen installed wooden frames, wedging beams between floor and ceiling, creating geometric patterns that held back the mountain. The wood creaked and groaned under the load. Sometimes a beam would snap with a sound like a gunshot. Sometimes an entire section would give way. Cave-ins killed men regularly. A sudden collapse could bury a crew in seconds, tons of rock falling faster than anyone could run. Sometimes survivors could dig victims out. Often, they could not. Bodies remained entombed in the rock, and the company simply sealed that section and opened new tunnels elsewhere. Fire presented an even worse horror. With limited ventilation and timber supports throughout the mines, a fire could spread rapidly, filling tunnels with smoke and poison gas. Men trapped behind a fire had little chance of escape. The constant noise never stopped. Drills hammered against rock. Ore cars rattled along tracks. Explosions echoed through connected tunnels. Pumps worked continuously, fighting the water that seeped from every crack. Ventilation fans roared, trying to push fresh air through the maze. Men shouted to communicate over the din. After a shift underground, a miner's ears would ring for hours. Many lost their hearing entirely after years of exposure. Shifts lasted 8 to 10 hours, sometimes longer if a crew needed to finish a particular section. The pay was modest, enough to support a family if you were careful, but nothing close to the wealth being extracted. $3 or $4 a day was standard for common labor, more for skilled positions like powdermen or timbering specialists. Set against the danger and difficulty of the work, the wages seemed almost an insult. Beneath Butte, more than 10,000 miles of tunnels created a city larger than the one above. Different mining, companies operated different sections, but over time the tunnels intersected and connected, creating a labyrinth no single person fully understood. Multiple levels existed, one below another, sometimes separated by hundreds of feet of rock. Shafts connected these levels, and passages ran horizontally in bewildering complexity. Men sometimes got lost in the maze. A miner might take a wrong turn in an unfamiliar section and wander for hours trying to find his way back. The tunnels looked similar, and without landmarks, direction became impossible to judge. Stories circulated of men found dead in abandoned sections, having wandered until exhaustion or bad air killed them. Other stories told of men who simply disappeared, never found, lost forever in the underground city. Yet despite the brutal conditions, a powerful camaraderie developed among the miners. Underground, men depended on each other absolutely. Your partner's attention could mean the difference between life and death. If a timber groaned, if bad air filled a passage, if something felt wrong, you trusted your fellow miners to recognize the danger and respond. That trust created bonds stronger than those on the surface. Ethnic divisions that mattered above ground faded somewhat in the darkness below. An Irish miner and a Finnish miner might live in separate neighborhoods and attend different churches, but underground they worked side by side. They shared water, helped each other lift heavy timbers, and watched for danger together. The solidarity was not complete. Tensions existed, especially when companies played ethnic groups against each other during strikes. But in the moment, when rock hung overhead and danger pressed from all sides, ethnicity mattered less than competence and courage. The mining culture that developed reflected the work itself, hard, direct, and loyal. Miners worked without complaint, drank heavily after shifts, and maintained fierce loyalty to their union. They understood their value. Without them, the copper stayed in the ground. They also understood their expendability. The companies would replace a dead miner within hours. This knowledge bred a dark humor and a fatalistic acceptance of risk. Every miner knew someone who had died underground. Death was not an abstract possibility. It was a constant presence. You heard the stories. You attended the funerals. You saw the widows and the children left without fathers. You knew that today's shift might be your last. And yet you went down anyway because you had a family to feed. Because the alternatives were worse. Because the work defined you and your place in the community. The worst disaster in Butte's history struck on June 8, 1917. A cable carrying men into the Granite Mountain mine caught fire. The flames spread to the shaft's timber supports, and the fire quickly grew out of control. Smoke and poisonous gas filled the connected tunnels. Men trapped below tried to seal themselves in side passages using makeshift barriers, hoping rescuers would reach them before the air ran out. Some wrote farewell messages to their families. The rescue efforts continued for days, but the fire's intensity and the gas made progress impossible. When workers finally reached the trapped men, they found 168 dead. Most had not burned. They had suffocated or been poisoned by gas. Some had survived for more than a day before the air gave out. The disaster shocked Butte and made national headlines. For a brief moment, the attention focused on mine safety, on the negligence that had allowed such conditions to exist. Then the moment passed. The company paid minimal compensation to families. The mine reopened after repairs. New safety measures were discussed but rarely implemented. Within months, the disaster faded from national attention. Butte's miners returned to work because they had no choice. The tunnels called them back, and they descended once more into the darkness, carrying the knowledge that they might not return. The copper needed to be extracted, and the companies that owned the hill were not about to let tragedy slow production for long. Chapter 5. The City Above. Butte's Golden Age. In the first decades of the 20th century, Butte reached its peak. The population climbed toward 100,000, making it one of the largest cities between Chicago and the Pacific Coast. Only Denver and San Francisco rivaled its size and importance in the West. Trains arrived daily, bringing newcomers and goods. The wealth flowing from beneath the streets seemed limitless, and the city that rose on top of that wealth reflected both ambition and excess. The Uptown District showcased Butte's aspirations. Grand buildings lined the streets, constructed from brick and stone in styles borrowed from eastern cities. The Finland Hotel stood as one of the finest establishments in the West, offering luxury accommodations to visiting businessmen and dignitaries. The Metals Bank building rose with columns and carved details that announced prosperity to anyone who looked. The Hennessy Building, the Silver Bow Block, and dozens of other structures gave Butte a skyline that suggested permanence and power. Opera houses and theaters brought culture to the rough mining town. The Broadway Theater hosted touring companies performing Shakespeare and popular melodramas. The Temple Theater offered vaudeville acts and moving pictures. Concert halls featured orchestras and famous singers who included Butte on their Western tours. For a city built on copper and violence, the commitment to high culture seemed almost defiant, as if the residents were determined to prove that civilization could flourish even in the most unlikely places. The wealthy built mansions that rivaled those in established eastern cities. Mine owners and top managers constructed homes with multiple stories, elaborate woodwork, and modern conveniences. These houses clustered in certain neighborhoods, creating pockets of elegance surrounded by the more modest homes of working families. The contrast was stark and visible. From the windows of a mansion, you could see the modest cottages where miners lived, and beyond them, the head frames of the mines that generated all the wealth. But Butte's true character revealed itself in the ethnic neighborhoods that gave the city its distinctive texture. Dublin Gulch sprawled through the western part of town, its streets filled with Irish families who had come from Cork, Kerry, and Donegal. The neighborhood had its own churches, its own social halls, its own rhythms of life. Men spoke with brogues thick enough that even other Americans struggled to understand them. Women maintained old traditions, cooking, familiar foods, and teaching children songs remembered from across the ocean. Finntown occupied the eastern sections, where Finnish immigrants had established a community that felt transported from Scandinavia. The sauna culture thrived here, with bathhouses where men gathered to sweat and socialize. Finnish was spoken as commonly as English. The neighborhood maintained a quiet dignity, its residents known for their work ethic and their reluctance to waste words. Meaderville, on the city's outskirts, belonged to the Italians. They had built a complete village within the larger city, with Italian groceries, bakeries, churches dedicated to familiar saints, and social clubs where men played cards and drank wine. The neighborhood had its own identity, its own festivals, its own sense of being a distinct place connected to, but separate from the rest of Butte. Chinatown existed in the shadows, its residents facing discrimination and violence but maintaining their community through resilience and mutual support. Other neighborhoods housed Eastern Europeans, Serbs, Croats, Poles, and immigrants from a dozen other regions. Each group maintained its language, religion, and traditions, creating a city of remarkable diversity for its time and place. Churches and union halls anchored community life. The Catholic churches, Protestant congregations, Orthodox temples, and synagogues served not just as places of worship, but as centers of ethnic identity and social connection. Union halls performed similar functions, providing meeting spaces, educational programs, and a sense of solidarity that transcended religious differences. In a city where corporate power dominated, these institutions gave ordinary people places they could control. The saloons numbered in the hundreds, perhaps over 300 at the city's peak. They operated around the clock, serving miners coming off shift at any hour. Some were rough establishments, sawdust on the floor and whiskey sold by the glass. Others offered more refinement, with carved bars, brass fixtures, and free lunches for paying customers. The saloons functioned as social centers, places where men gathered to drink, argue politics, share news, and escape the memories of what they had seen underground. Butte's red light district operated with an openness that shocked visitors from more respectable cities. The district sprawled along Mercury Street and the surrounding blocks, with cribs and parlor houses operating in full view. The city taxed the establishments and largely left them alone, recognizing that thousands of single men working dangerous jobs wanted certain services. Madams became known figures, some achieving a level of respectability despite their profession. The district was wild, sometimes violent, but also strangely organized, with its own rules and hierarchies. Entertainment came in every form. Boxing matches drew huge crowds, with fighters from around the country coming to Butte for purses that rivaled those in major eastern cities. Baseball teams competed in leagues that took the sport seriously. Music filled the saloons and theaters. This was a city that worked hard and played hard, where excess was celebrated rather than condemned. The city's reputation spread. Across the country, Butte was known as wild, dangerous, and wide open. Fortunes could be made and lost overnight. Violence erupted regularly. Yet the city was also vibrant, alive with energy and possibility. People who lived in Butte developed fierce loyalty to the place, defending it against outsiders who criticized its rough character. They knew its flaws, but they also knew its spirit. Colorful characters seemed drawn to Butte. The city attracted gamblers, con artists, labor radicals, entrepreneurs, and dreamers of every variety. Years later, a young boy named Robert Craig Neville would grow up in Butte's tough neighborhoods, shaped by the city's culture of risk-taking and physical courage. As Evil Neville, he would become famous for motorcycle jumps that seemed suicidal, a daredevil mentality that came directly from growing up in a place where men descended thousands of feet underground every day and accepted danger as the price of living. The festivals revealed the city's soul. St. Patrick's Day transformed Butte into a celebration that rivaled anything in Boston or New York. The entire city, not just the Irish, participated in parades, parties, and drinking that lasted for days. Finnish communities celebrated their own traditions, blending old country customs with American influences. Each ethnic group marked its holidays, creating a calendar of festivals that gave the year structure and meaning. Yet, beneath the celebration and vitality ran an undercurrent of contradiction. The wealth being generated was staggering, but most residents lived modestly. The grand buildings downtown stood blocks away from neighborhoods where families crowded into small houses. The copper flowing from the mines enriched distant investors, while the men who extracted it earned wages that barely covered necessities. The city functioned, prospered even, but the distribution of wealth remained profoundly unequal. In those peak years, Butte felt invincible. The copper seemed inexhaustible. The mines employed thousands and could employ thousands more. New tunnels opened constantly. Production climbed year after year. The city expanded, adding neighborhoods and infrastructure to accommodate continued growth. People spoke of Butte's future with confidence, assuming the boom would continue indefinitely. The copper would always be there, the mines would always operate, and the city would keep growing. But the city's fate was never in its own hands. Decisions about Butte's future were made in boardrooms a continent away, by men who had never walked its streets or descended into its mines. The copper belonged to corporations whose only concern was profit. As long as extraction remained profitable, Butte would thrive. When the mathematics changed, when other priorities emerged, when the cost of labor or the price of copper shifted the equations, those distant decision-makers would act according to their interests alone. Butte existed at their pleasure, and that pleasure would not last forever. Chapter 6: The First Cracks, Labor Wars, and Disasters. As the Anaconda Company consolidated its control over Butte in the early 1900s, tensions with labor intensified. The Butte Miners Union, established in 1878, had grown into one of the most powerful labor organizations in America. The union represented thousands of workers and had won significant concessions over the years. The 8-hour fixed day, minimum wage standards, and some safety improvements. But as corporate control tightened and profit margins became the only consideration, the relationship between workers and ownership deteriorated into open conflict. The miners understood their position. They extracted the wealth. Without their labor, the copper stayed in the ground, and the investors earned nothing. This gave them leverage, but it also made them targets. The Anaconda Company could not allow workers to threaten production or profits. The stage was set for battles that would turn violent and reshape the city. The company deployed methods refined by corporations across America. Spies infiltrated the union, attending meetings and reporting back on organizers and potential troublemakers. Blacklists circulated among mine managers, naming men who had participated in strikes or agitated for better conditions. A miner whose name appeared on a blacklist found himself unable to work anywhere in Butte. The company owned enough of the city's economy that being shut out of the mines often meant leaving town entirely. When tensions escalated into strikes, the company brought in strikebreakers, often armed men who had no connection to Butte and no sympathy for the workers. Violence erupted regularly. Picket lines turned into battlegrounds. Men fought with fists, clubs, and sometimes guns. The local police, often on the company payroll either directly or through political influence, sided with management. Arrests targeted union organizers while company enforcers operated with impunity. The labor war reached a peak in 1914 when a dispute over union leadership and company interference exploded into a full strike. Thousands of miners walked off the job. Production stopped. The company refused to negotiate, determined to break the union's power. Violence spread through the streets. Dynamite destroyed the Union Hall, killing one man and injuring dozens. No one was ever prosecuted for the bombing, though everyone suspected company involvement. Montana's governor declared martial law and called in the National Guard. Soldiers occupied Butte, patrolling the streets with rifles and establishing military authority over civilian government. The occupation lasted for months. Union meetings were banned. Organizers were arrested. The strike eventually collapsed under the weight of military force and economic pressure. Men returned to work on the company's terms, their union weakened, and their bargaining power diminished. The message was clear. The company controlled Butte, and resistance would be crushed. 3 years later, disaster struck with a force that exposed every flaw in the system the company had built. On June 8, 1917, a cable fire in the Granite Mountain mine spread out of control. The flames raced through timber supports, filling connected tunnels with smoke and poisonous gas. Men working thousands of feet below had only minutes to react. Some reached safety by climbing through shaft ladders or finding passages to other mines. Others found themselves trapped as smoke filled every escape route. Rescue efforts began immediately, but the fire's intensity and the gas concentrations made progress impossible. Miners from other crews volunteered to descend into the poisoned tunnels, risking their own lives to reach trapped men. Some rescuers died trying. The wait above ground turned agonizing. Wives and children gathered near the shaft, hoping for news, praying for survival. The fire burned for days. When rescue crews finally reached the deepest sections, they found 168 men dead. Most had suffocated or been poisoned by gas. Some had survived long enough to build barriers with whatever materials they could find, sealing themselves into small chambers and hoping the air would last until rescue arrived. It had not. Bodies were found with farewell messages scratched on walls or written on scraps of paper. Men had spent their final hours thinking of their families, knowing death was coming, unable to do anything but wait. The disaster made national headlines. Investigators arrived to determine the cause. The findings pointed to corporate negligence, inadequate safety measures, poor ventilation, lack of emergency procedures, and a culture that prioritized production over worker safety. The company had known the risks and had chosen to ignore them because addressing them would cost money and slow production. The Anaconda Company responded with a public relations campaign that blamed the miners themselves. Company statements suggested that workers had been careless, that they had ignored safety protocols, that the fire was an unavoidable accident rather than the result of systematic negligence. The widows and orphans left behind received minimal compensation. The company paid some claims to avoid worse publicity, but the amounts were calculated to be as small as possible. The anger in Butte was profound. Workers saw the disaster for what it was, proof that the company valued copper more than human lives. The aftermath radicalized many miners who had previously accepted the system. Into this volatile atmosphere came Frank Little, an organizer for the industrial workers of the world, known as the Wobblies. The IWW was more militant than the traditional unions, advocating for revolutionary change rather than negotiation within the existing system. Little was a powerful speaker, unafraid of confrontation, willing to say things other organizers whispered. He arrived in Butte in July 1917 and immediately began organizing. He spoke at rallies, condemning the company for the Granite Mountain deaths, calling for strikes and resistance. He attacked not just the Anaconda Company, but the entire system of corporate capitalism that treated workers as expendable. His speeches drew large crowds and alarmed the authorities. On the night of August 1st, 1917, masked men dragged Frank Little from his boarding house. They beat him, tied him behind a car, and dragged him through the streets to the edge of town. There, they hanged him from a railroad trestle and left his body swinging in the darkness. Pinned to his clothing was a warning. Others would face the same fate if they continued to agitate. The murder shocked the nation. Federal investigators arrived, but the killers were never identified. No one was ever arrested. The evidence pointed toward company involvement, or at least company encouragement, but nothing could be proven. The message, however, was unmistakable. Dissent would be met with violence, and the law would not protect those who challenged corporate power. Federal troops occupied Butte following Little's murder, ostensibly to maintain order, but effectively to suppress labor organizing. The military presence gave the company freedom to tighten control without fear of worker resistance. Union activities were monitored, radical organizers were arrested or driven from town. The labor movement in Butte, already weakened by the failed 1914 strike, suffered another devastating blow. Other disasters continued with grim regularity. Cave-ins killed men in ones and twos. Gas pockets claimed lives without warning. Equipment failures crushed workers. Fires broke out in tunnels. The death toll accumulated year after year, each incident investigated briefly and then forgotten. The company paid minimal compensation when legally required and nothing when it could avoid payment. Production always resumed quickly. Dead miners were replaced within hours. The human cost was staggering, but it remained largely invisible to those who profited from the copper. Investors in New York and Boston received dividend checks without thinking about the men who died to generate those profits. Company executives reviewed production figures and safety reports with clinical detachment. The miners and their families bore the grief and the loss alone. By the 1920s, copper prices began to fluctuate in ways that made Butte's leaders uneasy. The war had driven prices to historic highs, but peacetime brought uncertainty. New copper deposits were being developed in other countries where labor costs were lower. Synthetic materials were replacing copper in some applications. The sense of invincibility that had characterized Butte's boom years began to crack, yet the mines kept running. The tunnels kept spreading deeper and wider. Production continued at levels that still made Butte one of the world's largest copper sources. The warning signs were there for those willing to see them, but most people in Butte still believed the copper would last forever and the city would continue to thrive. They did not yet understand that the first cracks in the foundation would eventually bring down the entire structure, and that the worst was still to come. Chapter 7. The decline begins. Changing times. The end of World War I brought a sudden shift that caught Butte unprepared. During the war, copper demand had soared. Every shell casing, every electrical wire, every piece of military equipment required copper. The mines had operated at maximum capacity, production had climbed to record levels, and prices had reached heights that made even the war's earlier boom years look modest. Then, almost overnight, the war ended and demand collapsed. Copper prices fell sharply. The Anaconda Company responded the only way corporations know how, by cutting costs. Wages were reduced, shifts were shortened. Entire crews were laid off. The mines continued operating, but at reduced capacity. For the first time in decades, Butte faced the reality that its economy could contract as quickly as it had expanded. Then came the Great Depression, and what had been difficulty became catastrophe. By 1933, copper prices had fallen to levels that made mining barely profitable. The Anaconda Company shut down operations across Butte. Thousands of miners found themselves unemployed with no prospects and no savings. The city's population, which had peaked near 100,000, began to decline as families left in search of work elsewhere. The neighborhoods that had once bustled with life grew quieter. Houses stood empty, their windows dark. Businesses closed along the main streets. The saloons that had operated around the clock now opened sporadically, or not at all. The ethnic communities that had maintained vibrant cultures found their populations dwindling as young people left for cities where jobs still existed. The churches held smaller congregations. The union halls, once packed for meetings, now echoed with the voices of fewer and fewer members. Butte's decline was not just economic but visible. Buildings began to deteriorate without maintenance. Paint peeled, roofs leaked, sidewalks cracked and went unrepaired. The city government, its tax base shrinking along with the population, could not afford to maintain infrastructure. Streets developed potholes, parks grew wild. The physical fabric of the city started to fray. World War II brought a temporary reprieve that felt like salvation. Copper demand surged again. As America mobilized for war, the mines reopened. Men who had been unemployed for years descended once more into the tunnels. Production climbed, paychecks returned. For a few years, Butte felt like its old self, alive with purpose and activity. But those who paid attention recognized that this was not a true recovery. It was a spike driven by extraordinary circumstances, a temporary need that would end when the war did. The fundamental problems had not been solved. Butte's economy still depended entirely on a single commodity controlled by a single company. When the war ended, so would the boom. The post-war years confirmed those fears. Demand dropped again, though not as catastrophically as after World War I. Copper prices stabilized at levels that allowed continued operation but offered little room for growth. More ominously, new competition emerged from around the world. Copper deposits in Chile, Peru, and Africa were being developed by companies that paid workers a fraction of Butte's wages. Synthetic materials began replacing copper in some applications. The global market was changing in ways that made Butte's high-cost underground mining less competitive. The Anaconda Company began searching for ways to reduce costs further. Technology offered possibilities that had not existed before. New drilling equipment could do the work of multiple men. Improved explosives allowed larger blasts. Massive earth-moving machines were being developed that could handle volumes of material impossible for human crews. The company's engineers and accountants studied these technologies and performed calculations that did not favor Butte's thousands of underground miners. Underground mining was labor-intensive and expensive. The deeper the tunnels went, the more it cost to ventilate them, pump water from them, and transport ore through them. Wages, even reduced wages, represented a significant expense. The company looked at the numbers and recognized that the traditional methods that had built Butte were becoming obsolete. Through the 1950s, the population continued its slow decline. The census figures told the story in numbers: 100,000 down to 80,000, then 70, then 60. Each decade saw thousands more leave. The departures followed a pattern. Young people left first, seeking opportunities in cities where the economy was growing rather than shrinking. Families with children followed, wanting better schools and more stable futures. The elderly, and those too invested in Butte to leave, remained, watching their city empty around them. The tax base shrank along with the population, creating a vicious cycle. Fewer residents meant less revenue for the city government. Less revenue meant reduced services and deteriorating infrastructure. Poor conditions encouraged more people to leave, which further reduced the tax base. Buildings that had once been maintained were abandoned. Grand structures from Butte's peak years stood empty, their windows broken, their interiors stripped of anything valuable. A sense of unease settled over the city. People who had lived through the boom years could feel that something fundamental was changing. The mines still operated, the head frame still rose above the hill, ore cars still rattled through the tunnels, but the energy and confidence of earlier decades had evaporated. Butte felt like a place waiting for something, though no one could say exactly what. Rumors began circulating in the mid-1950s about a dramatic change the company was considering. Workers heard whispers about surface, about digging from above rather than tunneling from below. The idea seemed absurd at first. Butte had always been an underground mining town. The 10,000 miles of tunnels defined the city's relationship with the copper beneath it. Surface mining would mean something entirely different, though few people understood exactly what. Growing up in Butte during these years of decline was a young man named Robert Craig Knievel. He absorbed the city's culture of risk and defiance. As a teenager and young adult, he worked various jobs, including a brief stint in the mines. The story of his firing became legendary in Butte. He had taken an earth mover, a massive piece of mining equipment, and performed wheelies with it, showing off until he accidentally knocked out the city's power line. The company fired him immediately. The incident captured something essential about both Knievel and the city that shaped him. Butte had always been a place where men took outrageous risks, where caution was viewed with suspicion, where proving your courage mattered more than following rules. Young Knievel, who would later become famous as Evil Knievel, embodied that spirit perfectly. He would make a career out of motorcycle jumps that seemed suicidal, performing stunts that horrified and thrilled audiences in equal measure. That daredevil mentality came directly from growing up in a city where thousands of men descended into darkness every day, accepting danger as the price of making a living. But even as Knievel prepared to leave Butte and seek fame elsewhere, the city that had shaped him was approaching a transformation that would make his stunts seem tame by comparison. The company had made its decision. Surface mining was not just a rumor anymore. It was a plan, and that plan would change everything. Chapter 8. The Final Betrayal. The Berkeley Pit. In 1955, the Anaconda Company made an announcement that would seal Butte's fate. After decades of underground mining, after creating more than 10,000 miles of tunnels beneath the city, the company declared it would shift to a new method: open pit mining. Instead of sending men down into the earth to extract copper from deep veins, they would dig from the surface, carving an enormous hole into the hill itself. The company presented this decision as progress, as modernization necessary to keep Butte competitive. They promised the new method would be more efficient, more productive, and crucially, would save jobs. Company representatives assured worried workers that the transition would preserve employment and secure Butte's future. The newspapers, most of them owned or controlled by Anaconda, echoed these reassurances. This was good news, they insisted. This would save the city. The reality was darker and more calculated. Open pit mining required massive machines rather than large crews of skilled workers. A single huge power shovel could move more material in a day than hundreds of men working underground. The new method would indeed be more efficient, but efficiency meant fewer jobs, not more. The company knew this. The workers suspected it. But no one in Butte had the power to stop what was coming. The first problem was immediate and brutal. Entire neighborhoods stood in the way. The area. The company plan to excavate included established communities where families had lived for generations. Homes, churches, businesses, schools, all of it sat on top of copper the company intended to extract. These structures and the people who occupied them would have to go. The Anaconda Company began buying property, making offers that were officially voluntary but functionally mandatory. The company controlled the local economy, the political system, and the courts. Residents who refused to sell found themselves fighting a battle they could not win. Property values were assessed at levels favorable to the company. Legal challenges disappeared into a court system that had long ago learned whose interests to serve. Meterville bore the worst of it. This Italian neighborhood on the eastern edge of Butte had existed since the 1890s. Generations of families had built lives there, maintaining the culture and traditions they had carried from Italy. The neighborhood had its own identity: Our Lady of Lourdes Church, Italian groceries and bakeries, social clubs where men gathered to play cards, homes filled with memories and accumulated history. All of it stood on ground the company wanted to dig up. The residents of Meterville protested, organized, and pleaded. They argued that the neighborhood had value beyond the copper beneath it, that a community could not simply be erased for corporate profit. Their protests received sympathetic coverage in the few newspapers not controlled by Anaconda, but sympathy changed nothing. The company owned the land, the politicians, and ultimately the city's future. One by one, families accepted buyout offers and moved away. The church held its final mass. Businesses closed their doors for the last time. In 1955, the digging began. Massive power shovels, some of the largest machines ever built, started carving into the hill. Each shovel could hold tons of material in a single scoop. They worked in rotation, biting into the earth, loading trucks that hauled the material to processing facilities. The operation required dozens of workers instead of thousands, operating machines instead of swinging picks. As the surface operation expanded, the underground mines were abandoned. The tunnels that had taken decades to create, the passages that stretched for thousands of miles beneath Butte, were simply left behind. The company stopped maintaining them, stopped pumping water from them, stopped caring about them. Many were deliberately flooded or sealed. The underground city that had defined Butte for generations was discarded like a used tool, no longer needed, no longer worth the expense of upkeep. Thousands of miners lost their jobs despite the company's promises. Some found work in the pit operation, but these positions required different skills and paid wages calculated to match the reduced labor costs the new method was supposed to achieve. Most found themselves unemployed, their expertise in underground mining suddenly worthless. The union, already weakened by decades of conflict and corporate pressure, could do little. The few strikes that were attempted collapsed quickly under economic pressure. The pit grew steadily, year after year. The machines dug deeper and wider, following the copper wherever it led. The hole expanded until it consumed the neighborhoods that had been cleared. Meterville disappeared entirely, swallowed by the advancing pit. Streets where children had played, gardens where families had grown vegetables, churches where generations had been baptized and married and mourned, all of it vanished into the growing crater. By the time the digging stopped, the Berkeley pit stretched more than a mile across and reached depths of 1,800 feet. It became one of the largest human-made excavations on Earth, a hole so vast it could be seen from space. The scale was staggering, but so was what had been destroyed to create it. An entire section of the city had been erased, and the 10,000 miles of tunnels that had once been Butte's pride now sat flooded and abandoned beneath what remained of the streets. The environmental cost was recognized but ignored. Mining operations produced toxic water contaminated with heavy metals and acid. This water was pumped out of the pit and processed minimally before being released into the local watershed. Air quality deteriorated as dust from the pit operations spread across the city. The groundwater beneath Butte became poisoned, though the full extent of the contamination would not be understood for years. Through the 1960s and 1970s, the pit continued operating. Production remained substantial, but copper prices fluctuated wildly. The global market shifted in ways that made even the pit's efficiency marginal. Competition from foreign mines intensified. The economics that had justified the shift to open pit mining began to look less favorable. In the late 1970s, copper prices crashed. The Anaconda Company, already struggling with debt and changing market conditions, found itself unable to maintain profitability. In 1977, Arco, the Atlantic Richfield Company, purchased Anaconda and inherited all its assets and liabilities. Arco executives reviewed the situation with fresh eyes and saw a failing operation in a declining city. The Berkeley pit was still producing copper, but not enough to justify continued investment. The final betrayal came in 1982. Arco announced that mining operations would cease. More devastating, they declared they would shut down the pumps that had been keeping water out of the pit and out of the flooded underground mines. These pumps had operated continuously since the pit opened, working day and night to prevent water from accumulating. Without them, groundwater would flow into the excavation and begin filling it. Arco presented this as an economic necessity. The pumps were expensive to operate and, without active mining, there was no reason to continue paying for them. The company acknowledged that water would accumulate in the pit, but they downplayed the consequences. It would take years to fill, they said. The situation could be managed. The pumps were turned off. Water began rising immediately. It pooled at the bottom of the pit and started climbing. The water was not clean. It dissolved metals from the exposed rock, copper, arsenic, cadmium, zinc, and sulfuric acid. The pit became a massive container of toxic soup, growing more concentrated and more poisonous as the water level rose. The same process occurred in the flooded underground mines, where more than 10,000 miles of tunnels slowly filled with contaminated water. In 1983, Arco made its final move. The company sold what remained of its Butte operations and withdrew from the city. They left behind the Berkeley pit, already filling with poisoned water. They left behind the flooded mines beneath the streets, a hidden network of tunnels that would remain toxic for thousands of years. They left behind thousands of unemployed workers in a city whose economy had been built entirely around mining. Butte was left to face the consequences alone. The population, which had already been declining, dropped sharply. By the mid-1980s, fewer than 35,000 people remained in a city that had once housed 100,000. Buildings stood empty. Entire blocks were abandoned. The tax base collapsed, making it impossible for the city to maintain basic services. The Berkeley pit continued filling with toxic water, rising slowly but steadily toward levels that threatened to contaminate the entire valley's groundwater. The company that had created the problem was gone, having extracted all the profit it could and then walked away. What remained was a poisoned lake in the center of a dying city, a monument to corporate greed and the true cost of extraction. The richest hill on Earth had been drained completely, and what flowed back into the void was not wealth, but poison. Chapter 9. Abandonment and Aftermath. The Poisoned Legacy. By the late 1980s, Butte had become a ghost of itself. The population that had once approached 100,000 had fallen below 30,000 and continued dropping. Entire neighborhoods stood empty, houses abandoned to weather and decay. Downtown, the grand buildings that had announced Butte's importance now sat hollow. Windows were boarded or broken. Retail spaces that had once bustled with customers were dark and silent. Paint peeled from facades no one could afford to maintain. Walking the main streets felt like moving through a monument to a vanished era. The Berkeley pit dominated everything, physically and psychologically. The toxic lake continued rising, its water growing more poisonous with each passing year. The acids dissolved more metals from the exposed rock. The concentration of contaminants increased. By the 1990s, the water had become lethal to almost any living thing that touched it. In November 1995, a flock of snow geese migrating south stopped to rest on what appeared to be a large lake. 342 geese landed on the Berkeley pit's toxic water. Within hours, all of them were dead. Their bodies floated on the rust-colored surface, white feathers against red water, a tableau of death that captured national attention. The incident became a symbol of what Butte had become, a place so poisoned that even birds passing overhead could not survive contact with it. The federal government could no longer ignore the disaster. The Environmental Protection Agency designated Butte as one of the largest Superfund sites in America, an area requiring massive environmental remediation at government expense. The designation acknowledged what was obvious to anyone who looked. Butte was an environmental catastrophe, poisoned by a century of unregulated mining and then abandoned by the companies that had created the damage. Cleanup efforts began, but immediately raised questions that had no good answers. Who would pay? Arco, which had purchased Anaconda and shut down the operations, denied responsibility. They argued they had simply purchased a company, not accepted liability for a century of environmental damage. The legal battle stretched on for years, consuming resources while the contamination spread. Meanwhile, the water in the pit kept rising. Engineers calculated that if the water level reached the surrounding groundwater table, the contamination would spread throughout the entire valley. Everything downstream would be poisoned: wells, streams, soil, and aquifers that supplied communities across the region. A treatment plant was eventually built to process the water and prevent this catastrophe, but it was fundamentally a temporary solution to a permanent problem. The pit would continue filling for thousands of years. Even with treatment, even with monitoring, the toxic lake would remain at the center of Butte, a wound that would never heal. The cost of maintaining the treatment systems would continue indefinitely, paid by taxpayers rather than by the corporations that had profited from the mining. Beneath the city's streets, the flooded tunnels presented their own dangers. More than 10,000 miles of passages sat filled with contaminated water, creating voids and weaknesses. In the ground, sinkholes began opening without warning. A street would suddenly collapse, revealing a shaft or tunnel that had been hidden beneath pavement. Buildings settled as the ground beneath them shifted. Some structures simply fell into the hollows, disappearing into the darkness. The hill itself had become unstable, literally undermined by the tunnels that honeycombed through it. Engineers warned that entire sections could collapse. Maps of the underground workings were incomplete or lost. No one knew exactly where all the tunnels ran or how stable the ground was in any given location. The city that had been built on top of the mines now discovered it was built on top of nothing, on a hollow shell that could give way at any moment. What remained was a small community struggling to maintain a city built for 100,000 people. The infrastructure, water systems, roads, electrical grids, had been designed for a much larger population. With fewer than 30,000 residents and a collapsed tax base, maintaining these systems became nearly impossible. Services were cut. Streets went unrepaired. The city government made difficult choices about what to preserve and what to let go. Tourism emerged as one of the few sources of outside revenue, but it came with bitter irony. People traveled to Butte to see the Berkeley pit, to stand at the viewing platform and stare into the toxic lake that had destroyed the city. They came to see the ruins, the abandoned buildings, the physical evidence of industrial decline. Butte's main attraction had become the hole that killed it, and the city charged admission to look at its own corpse. Yet amid the abandonment and decay, something survived. The community held onto its identity with fierce determination. The Irish heritage remained strong, celebrated through An Rí Rá, Montana's Irish Cultural Heritage Festival. St. Patrick's Day in Butte continued to draw crowds, the celebration maintaining traditions that connected present residents to ancestors who had worked in the mines generations earlier. St. Urho's Day, a Finnish-American celebration, carried on as well, keeping alive the ethnic diversity that had once defined the city. These festivals and traditions served a purpose beyond entertainment. They reminded people that Butte was more than a Superfund site, more than a toxic pit, more than an industrial disaster. It was a place where real people had built lives, raised families, created culture, and forged communities that mattered. The mining companies had taken the copper and left behind poison, but they could not erase the human connections and shared history that still bound the remaining residents together. The question that haunted Butte had no easy answer. What do you do when your city was built for one purpose, and that purpose is gone? How do you survive when the industry that created your home has abandoned it? How do you maintain hope when the ground beneath you is literally hollow and the water rising in the pit grows more toxic every year? The people who remained in Butte faced these questions daily, and their presence was itself an act of defiance against the forces that had drained their city and walked away. Chapter 10. The Earth Remembers. Butte's story is a parable about extraction economies and their true cost. The pattern repeats across America. Coal towns in Appalachia, steel cities in the Rust Belt, mill communities throughout the industrial heartland. When corporations control a city's fate, when profit is the only priority, the ending is always the same. The wealth was never Butte's. It flowed through on its way to distant shareholders, leaving behind poison, poverty, and more than 10,000 miles of abandoned tunnels. The environmental damage will last centuries. The flooded passages beneath the streets form a toxic tomb. The Berkeley pit stands as a monument to corporate greed, a wound that will never heal. Yet, resilience survives. Modern Butte is smaller, struggling, but alive. And Rira keeps Irish heritage vibrant. St. Patrick's Day and St. Urho's Day maintain ethnic traditions. Museums preserve mining history. The community refuses to let Butte be forgotten. What Butte teaches matters beyond Montana. It reveals what happens when communities build their futures on finite resources controlled by outside interests. The warning is clear and urgent. The pit still fills with poisoned water. The hill stands hollow, undermined by the tunnels that once made it the richest hill on Earth. The copper is gone. The companies are gone. What remains is both warning and testament to the miners who died below, to the families displaced, to those who stayed. The Earth remembers what we take, and the bill always comes due.